So I'd like to see how they respond. That might be a little bit telling as well, how the propaganda goes one way or the other. And I don't know if has Colombia made any statements?
Yeah, Colombia, Petro, I mean, he's condemned it and all that. And again, I mean, we talked about this earlier. If you're looking at, and I think this goes to Hussein's point, but I think if you're analyzing this from a Latin American politics, right? Look, in Latin America, generally in politics, there's swings generally within the countries, to the left, to the right, to the left, to the right. Now we are clearly in a right wing swing, clearly in a right wing. I mean, Chile and Bolivia, just two of the recent ones, have clearly swung not only right, but hard right. Extreme right.
And you've got El Salvador,
right?
You've
But
got
El Salvador
Peru.
is known, but yes, El Salvador, Ecuador. So let's look: Chile, Bolivia, even Peru. You have El Salvador, Argentina, Guatemala, Honduras.
So Cuba's the wild card. Cuba was suffering while Venezuela was surrounded, right? They're very dependent.
Right. So
on
it's
Venezuela.
The Venezuela-Cuban relationship, and one more country I'd like to highlight: the Dominican Republic as well. So Cuba and all that. So really, the main countries from a diplomatic sense who can maybe provide some condemnation and support for this is going to be Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico. Obviously, Cuba and Nicaragua, right? The problem is with the question now remains: how does a post-Maduro government look like inside of Venezuela? Do we see a coalescing within the regime, right? Diosdado Cabello, Padrino Lopez, Delcy, right? Do they coalesce, or do they splinter and have their own little fighting and infaction? And two, how does the opposition kind of come in? Does the opposition try to take over? Does the opposition try to come in? Does the opposition try to do something, right? Is there a transitional government or not? There's just a lot of things that this can go by that we just don't know yet. And I think the press statement at 11 o'clock and kind of, in a couple of hours, well, in 6 or 5 hours, is going to be key, because it's going to give us a lot more information on what's going on and see what is the subsequent thing. Because with Maduro gone, like, does the U.S. continue to do strikes on narco boats in the Pacific and the Caribbean? Like, there's a lot of things that we can speculate. We just need more reporting to have a better idea.
From a national security perspective, the most important component is we need to deal with Cuba. I'm sorry. You'll see it on my feed consistently. I always say about free Cuba. It is such a national security threat domestically. In so many ways, I've tried to provide as much education about the Neville Singham operation through there, the Chinese involvement there, the training down there of just U.S. university students, and these different protest groups. I'd call them domestic terrorist groups. But the pipeline from the universities down into Cuba and the People's Forum, all of this stuff, just a huge national security threat. So what are your thoughts on Cuba? And they really do need a pipeline. I mean, it would be such a strategic, I'm sorry, I'm a doctrine move, but I know you don't like to hear this, but it would be so important for us. It would harm, it would piss off Russia, Iran, China, all the ones in terms of establishing deterrence. I think it would be a huge win, and for the Cuban people as well. Let's be really honest. And there's
would it be like a huge win, like Israel?
No,
Iraq,
just shut up. Don't be stupid. Just don't be stupid.
Those kind of wins you're talking about?
No, these people are starving over there. Let's just be realistic. They don't have electricity.
Are they invading Florida right now from Cuba?
It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with our national security. The Chinese are monitoring us.
There is no national security from a country that's got an economy of zero compared to yours, whose military is zero compared to yours. What are you talking about? You're blatantly just trying to get another invasion going.
I don't have a
desire to speak with
pro-jihadists. No, you're a pro-jihadist.
You're a maniac. That's all it is.
Hold on. Okay. Let's pause this for a second. I'm going to go to Brian, and then I'm going to go to Christopher, because they have their hands up, and I want to be respectful.
I did want your answer about Cuba.
So I think Cuba. What I need. Well, first of all, there might be dead Cubans because of this operation, right? Cuba clearly. I think Venezuela is much more key than Cuba. Cuba provided a lot of the intelligence support and military support for Maduro, but Maduro provided the economic lifeline. Without Maduro, it's very hard. We already know that the economic crisis in Cuba was deteriorating significantly because of the blockade against Venezuela. The economic crisis was worsening. We've seen blackouts. We've seen protests. Obviously, that's the next question. We haven't necessarily seen the United States do a military focus against Cuba as they did against Maduro. And so that's the key question. But again, we don't know how Cuba is going to be dependent on Venezuela. The question is, how does Venezuela look after Maduro? Depending on that, that's going to be the key component of how Cuba looks. But we already know a significant amount of problems. And more importantly, we've talked about the oil embargo and the blockade impacting Venezuela. We have no indication that that's going to end anytime soon. They did an operation, they got Maduro. For all we know, all these blockades, the reports that we got before this operation, like that was going to be in place for months. And that might still be in place until the Trump administration feels the opposition takes power, is in charge. And if that's the case, Cuba is in a world of trouble because then they've lost their only ally that's been able to sustain them for the last couple of decades. But with that, I'm going to go to...
You've seen the Chinese make a statement about the UN security, right, Council?
Yeah, but hold on. I do want to give a second to go to some of the hands. So let me go to Brian, and then we'll go to Christopher, and then we'll go back to you, Seth. Go ahead, Brian.
Thanks there. Good conversation you're running here, man. So look, two main points I want to make. First about Rubio, second about Trump. Rubio, okay, Marco Rubio, who Trump denigrated for a long time as Little Marco. Let's just be absolutely clear. Trump does not respect Rubio. He doesn't respect the Department of State. He gave Marco Rubio the Department of State in part because he doesn't respect either of those things. He has had Steve Witkoff, Barack, others doing a real heavy diplomacy. Now, one area that Rubio has carved out for himself, though, is South America and Latin America. So this is kind of his shot to shine. And he has been talked over, ignored, disrespected, like inside the Trump administration. Rubio has been very unhappy. And this is his one real chance, I think, to, in his view, try to shine. And with the success, but regardless of, look, we all know I don't like Trump, and don't like Trump is an understatement. But in terms of if a simple tactical objective was go in, knock out some capabilities, and get the president out with or without his wife, tactically we can look at that as a success, right? But Rubio strategically has been talking about this region for a while, and he's one of the people pushing Trump to do a lot more muscular activity in the region. So he's going to be possibly advocating the same type of thing for Cuba, or something much more muscular for Cuba. He already has been, right? But with this succeeding, you can probably expect a much more robust, hostile approach to Cuba. But the question remains is how much influence will Rubio have? And this gets to my second point about Trump, but in general, with this administration, it's very hard to tell who has what portfolio for how long, and are they working out with someone else at cross purposes or not. At a certain point, they were telling other people to stand down on the Latin America stuff because they were switching who was doing what. Okay, Rubio kept getting moved around, whether or not he realized it even half the time. Okay, so right now it looks like Rubio has had some success and influence. But the question remains, we can't really say who's really going to be running point on all this stuff and who's really going to be making the decisions. That's a big part of the problem. And to go to Trump, and my final point here, if you look at that New York Times piece that did a graphic of Trump's international relationships and diplomacy and business relationships and how everything's intermixed and mingled, and you just don't know who's doing what and what's being presented. What worries me, and what's completely legitimate to ask about, is what deals were made. Were they for Trump hotels or U.S. interests? We really don't know. And Trump doesn't separate the two. He sees Trump agreements or whatever things were set up with whoever we were talking to. But now that we've gotten rid of Maduro, it'll be very interesting to see. Do we really try to help promote democracy in Venezuela, or we just want to see a left-wing dictatorship replaced with a right-wing one? Because Trump is promoting right-wing dictatorships and right-wing governments all throughout Latin America that are becoming increasingly less democratic and dictatorial. So I really hope Venezuela is going to come out with a democracy that respects the will of the people and is not just going to replace one strongman for another that just happens to support Trump. Because I'm really nervous. The more I think about this, I'm afraid that the Venezuelan people might not get what they deserve, but we might just do another bullshit regime change that we've done many, many other times. And I'm really hoping that it's much better than that.
So let me go to Christopher, because he had to stand up for a while, and then we'll continue with the debate. Go ahead, Christopher.
Sure. Thank you very much. As I mentioned earlier, today here in Moscow, I just got off the phone with some members of the Russian Duma. And the ongoing statements here, of course, we had the Russian Foreign Ministry condemn this act of aggression by the United States. And of course, I think there's going to be a UN Security Council meeting convened at the request of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. I think that I also was able to talk with the Vice Minister of Communications, her deputy, who's a friend, who's also at Miraflores now at the presidential palace, and conveyed what Delcy was saying, which was that, of course, this kidnapping did occur, and the armed forces are in control still. So I think to your earlier point, there's a real question mark as to was the objective just Maduro, or is the objective regime change? Because if it's regime change, then I foresee some ongoing kinetic actions to try to knock out further capabilities of the Venezuelan army. But if it was simply to capture Maduro and to parade him around, so Trump could have a quick special military operation of his own, then that will be a publicity stunt, but it won't change necessarily what's on the ground. If the goal is regime change, I foresee a much longer and prolonged military action, and I don't think that Venezuelan society is united necessarily in one way or the other. I think there's deep polarization within the society, and I think the opposition will try to seize the momentum, but there are hardliners on the other side with weapons, including some of the former communist guerrilla groups in neighboring countries who have made Venezuela their home and their residence. So we have thousands of people who have engaged in guerrilla warfare in Latin America since the 1970s who live in Venezuela. So we can see a prolonged civil war type scenario. But in any case, I think that this news has certainly been very disturbing for the Russians, and of course will complicate matters in terms of peace agreement on Ukraine and on the ongoing special military operation that's still ongoing and still very fierce on the battlefield. Thank you.
And I guess, Christopher, just to kind of follow up, so within the construct of Steve Woodcock, Jared Kushner, I'm trying to tie in a little bit what Brian said and kind of your perspective. Are you hearing then from your perspective that the strike that the U.S. did, because you said this earlier before you came back on, you think this is going to hamper some of these the Trump-led peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine? Do you think this is going to have an impact on that, or is that something that the Russians are just going to kind of compartmentalize what happened in Venezuela and continue business as normal?
I think it's definitely definitely complicate the situation, because the hardliners here are basically saying, look, the U.S. can't be trusted. Okay, we understand that some prominent Russians like Kirill Dmitriev studied in the U.S. and have a more favorable look on the U.S., but the hardliners, like the Medvedev kind of crowd, and I think some of even formerly imprisoned Victor Bout, who's in LDPR, they're basically saying no compromise, no retreat on our goals and our objectives. And Russia now has the advantage on the battlefield. I just was in Donetsk and Zaporozhye and Kherson Oblast, and Russia definitely has the advantage on the battlefield now. So they're basically saying, okay, we'll continue to have negotiations, but the main negotiating position is on the battlefield at this point. And I think that this is certainly going to say that Trump is not a worthwhile partner in terms of doing business with. Of course, we have the loss of Syria last in 2024, at the end of 2024, and now Venezuela, the possibility of it also collapsing. So I think that there's a big concern that ultimately, and this is the fear that has always sort of plagued many Russians, that Russia is always on the docket, so to speak, always in the firing line. And so they fear that the U.S. is going to turn their guns slowly on them as this history reveals. And I think that that's a concern also in China as well. Speaking to friends in China today, there's also concerns there as well.